Hello, welcome to another Running Free Skills session. My name's Denise Erickson and I'm co-founder of Media Mentors. And with ACME, we're delighted to be bringing you these sessions. Now, this week, it's archives, the deep... What? Oh my God. What was I saying? Oh, the deep, dark world of archives and clearances for pictures behind you. Our guest this week is Kate Pappas, a producer who knows all about that, and she's worked with my co-founder Esther Coleman Hawkins for years. So over to the homemade studio for Esther and Kate to chat about it all.
So this session is about the joy of archive. In my experience, people fall into one of two camps. One, they use archive willy-nilly without any thought and they think they can use whatever they want. Two, they're terrified of it and never use archive. So to help us through this minefield, we have got Kate Pappas. She is the executive producer from Wild Bear. And hi, Kate.
Hi, Esther. Hello, everybody.
So, Kate, do you want to start off by telling us a bit about your career and how you've ended up kind of doing so much with archive?
Well, I've been working in factual and documentary television for over 20 years. And in that space, in that time, I have worked across pretty much all genres, from factual, documentary, docusoaps, blue chip science, history, wildlife, a whole bunch of different styles, feature docs, all that kind of thing. And in every single one of those series or programs I've worked on, there has been some form of clearance or archive involved in every way. So it really is a very, very vital part of factual storytelling, and one that it can be quite complex, but it's really important to get your head around it because it's a great tool.
Okay, starting at the beginning. When we talk about archive, what do we actually mean?
When we talk about archive, or when I talk about archive, I am usually referring to third-party material that has not, usually visual, although not always, but usually visual material that has not been created by the production. So it hasn't been shot, it hasn't been designed, it hasn't been scored, any of those kind of things. It is someone else's material that you are licensing for use in a production.
Great. And we're going to, obviously music could come under that heading, but we're going to leave music to somebody else because it is a whole different ball game.
Definitely.
So why would we want to use archive? I mean, in general, not just specifically at the moment when we can't necessarily go out and shoot things, but what does archive bring?
Archive brings an incredible palette or toolkit to your factual storytelling. It gives you breadth to tell your story in different ways. So a lot of, as you all know, a lot of factual and documentary is told via talking head interviews or observational documentary style, or sometimes graphics animation. By using third-party material, by which you can mean stills, sometimes artworks, historical third-party material, even contemporary third-party stock footage. By bringing all those into your story, you're able to provide, verification of the story that you're telling. So in a factual space, not making things up is really important, and being able to prove that you're not making things up is very important. So historical archive and even personal archive and memories and photographs and those kind of things can add to that sort of toolkit. It also helps if you're trying to be a bit more metaphoric or allegorical in your visual storytelling. So if you want to kind of allude to an idea or a concept or something, you can use material that's not something you're able to afford to shoot. It can also be economic. So if you can't afford to get an amazing, helicopter shot of New York City, but you need one to help tell your story, that's a great way to sort of save on costs. And also, if something's already been shot, and it's not vital for the style to be shot differently, we're also helping the environment by not going out and reshooting things again. And you can spend more of that money on screen in a different way. And also in the sort of slightly more niche space in, say, wildlife filmmaking, you don't often have the opportunity to shoot all the things that you need for wildlife filmmaking. So sometimes you can borrow from what other people have already shot. But that's very specific and that's very subject to species and accuracy and the scientific veracity we give. That's a different kind of ballgame again.
Okay. So, thinking about the editorial process now, when do we start looking for archive? And does it depend on what kind of program it is? Talk me through that editorial process.
Okay, so archive, it can come into the editorial process in, quite a few different ways. And it depends on the kind of story and the kind of film, like you say, that we're actually making. So one way of doing it is to map out the story beats ahead of time, so you roughly know what it is you're trying to tell. You do your research. You want to say, A, B, and C happens. You're going to get an interview from someone who can talk to these points. How do I colour in those points with historical or personal stills archives to kind of to flesh that out? So the process for that would be for the director or the series producer or whoever it is to go through and map out all those story beats. They then pull out a list of desired archive and images, and that goes off to an archive researcher or a researcher, or depending on how big the production, possibly the director themselves, to then go and find and then pull it, and then that gets sort of put through the editorial process.
Can you give me an example of a program that you've worked on that has worked to that model, and what? Tell me a little bit about the things that work, the things that make it difficult.
So I've worked on a few series that use that kind of model. One was, Immigration Nation: A Story of Us, and more recently I worked on a project called Deception by Design, which is looking at the art or the role of artists in camouflage design. So it's a combination of sort of contemporary footage, but also historical footage that's used to tell a story. So Johnny, the director, went through and mapped out and scripted everything. At the same time, we were constantly searching for archive, both contemporary creative archive in terms of something a bit more abstract, but also really clear, specific historical archive that helps tell the story that we're trying to tell. So, say in World War One and World War Two, we often used artists as part of these camouflages to help design camouflage because of their artist skills. So what we would look for is A, examples of historical footage of artists creating, paper mache cows or all sorts of things, or B, examples of their actual artworks as well. So you can sort of see from the artworks what their specific artistic skill is and how that was then used in camouflage and in war. So Max Dupain was a great example of one of the artists that we used. It's the joy of that is that it's so incredible to be able to unearth these beautiful visual, treats and feasts that you can throw in to help tell the story. That history is not always black and white. You can use colourful artworks or those kind of things. But sometimes it can be there's actually quite a lot of archive for you to have to actually go through and manage and sort, and it has to be done in a really methodical and really sort of like the workflow about how you manage the archive, how it comes in, what subjects it's underneath, how it goes onto the edit team, who's got what the resolution is. It's quite complex as well.
And what are the key, are there kind of key problems that you've faced with that kind of method? Are there kind of things that you've really learned from doing those, from maybe doing Deception by Design?
There are things I've learnt from, so over time you learn, every project you do, you learn something new. So the first sort of archive projects I worked on, perhaps the systems weren't so well established. Perhaps there were editors who were allowed to bring things into the edit that, hadn't gone through a particular system. Perhaps what was able to be accessed and where you found it wasn't so, I didn't know so well, or the teams I was working with didn't know so well. But over time, I sort of, every time if you don't learn from your previous project, then I think you should repeat work practice. So over time, I think I've developed with the people I've worked with a really good system, and we'll be able to keep that in place. But the pitfalls can be, if you don't have no idea where your original source comes from, if you haven't cleared that source before you've put it in the cut and the editor and the director love it, and then you realise it doesn't, it's really hard to find. If you have masters that don't match the original, like the low-res file names, therefore you can't online it properly. If the clearances are like a lot more complex, for example, in artworks, clearances can often go through more than one person. sometimes you license news footage, or not news footage, say talk show footage, and you have to then license the famous person who's on there, as well as the footage, as well as the news that kind of goes in there as well. So often it's not as straightforward as just grabbing something and whacking it in. So I guess you learn by trial and error, and it's not, when it isn't done well, it's actually quite awful. So you actually make sure that you don't do it badly again. And so it's a really good kind of way to, refine these sort of techniques.
Yeah. I worked on a show all about art, and I cannot tell you how many times I wished we'd had better conversations at the beginning about clearances. We had one piece of artwork that everyone was convinced would be really easy to clear, but it turned out that the artist had passed the copyright ownership onto somebody else who turned out to be a 92-year-old woman who lived in France, who didn't have any electric forms of communication. The only way we could get in touch was we had to write to her in French, and we conducted these negotiations by letter. Who even knew?
No, I worked on a series called The Art of Australia, which was 3 by 1 hours. That was wall-to-wall art. It was just stills and images, and the archive researchers on that were like, without them, we would have had with Jenny O'Mara and Wim Kemser, but without them, would have been an absolute nightmare. But it is very complex because you don't know who the estate has passed on copyright to. You don't know what that person is like. You don't know if they like television. You don't know if they like the person who gave them the first. You have no idea. It becomes really specific and really personal, and it's legal. So at the end of the day, it's about who gives you permission to use that work, and that's, you can't really argue with that.
Now, back to, what about, rather than writing the story first and finding the archive to fit, what about the process of making a show from archive, using the archive as the inspiration? Can you talk a bit about that process?
So I'm currently working on a beautiful feature doc called Valerie, which is about the life story of Valerie Taylor. And that is being made, I think 90% of that program will be from Valerie and her late husband Ron's own archive. They basically filmed themselves and underwater animals for 40 years. And so we have this huge wealth of material with which we're making a film about her life and her incredible contribution to marine science. About the way the director Sally Atkin has approached that is that we have her diaries, which are sort of a source of archive in themselves, and her film footage, and also the films that were made with her and Ron's involvement. So I think they were involved in the stunt scenes in Jaws, but they also made their own underwater documentaries. And so through tracking their history through their own work, we're able to put together the story and the approach in that way. So what Sally did in the first instance was sort of put a timeline together of all the events and all the things that we have captured on footage, and then from them work backwards from there. So that's a different model. And so then you start looking at what you have to tell the story, what are those elements are, and then how you can tell a story with those particular things. So whether it be the films or the filmography, or whether it be the diaries or whatever, and then you use additional archive on top of that, obviously, to sort of beef it up and tell other things, and intersperse some interviews and other things in there to hit the points that you aren't able to get from the existing archive. So it's actually working in reverse.
Interesting. I've never made a show like that. It sounds like a really like doing a reverse. It's like doing a reverse jigsaw puzzle.
Well, the trick with those ones, as well as there is so much material to work with, you have to also have a clear idea of where you want to start, or else you can drown. And again, methodology and editorial approach is really key into not drowning in all the content. But yeah, it is. It's literally the opposite way of telling a story, but just as effective. Like, I imagine that Maradona would have approached it in a very similar way, or they would have be able to map out the key moments in Maradona's life around a certain thing, and then use the existing material archive they have to sort of retrofit the story around it. And obviously, it works incredibly well. It's a great film. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, you've mentioned workflow a couple of times. Now, I don't want to get like super geeky, but so I the show I worked on that had the Nightmare art clearances, I have to say our workflow wasn't the smoothest workflow I've ever encountered. Like, we just hadn't got it nailed. We hadn't got it nailed, and we had stuff coming from so many sources. And we did encounter all the problems that you've mentioned. So particularly the one that kills me the most is when you put something into a cart and everyone falls in love with that shot, and then you discover that you really can't have that piece of archive. Like, no way, no way. So let's have a chat about workflow. Go on.
Okay, so workflow. I guess at the start you asked me what is archive, and I guess that comes back to the golden sort of rule: is that archive is material that you don't own, and so if it's material that you don't own, you have to seek permission to be able to use it, and that goes for anything that's not yours. You have to ask if you're going to use it. So in terms of workflow, you have to think about how easy is it to find the person that owns the work you're looking at. How likely are they to give you permission, and start that process off early and document that process from the absolute beginning. The way that we've been working recently at Wild Bear on the Valerie project is, we've been really quite militant and strict about what is allowed into the cut, and that is based on whether we're able to trace back the licensor and whether they're likely to agree on how much it's going to cost. So we have a really detailed spreadsheet about all the searches that we've done, where they've come from, who owns it, have they given us permission, and, can we afford it? Once it sort of goes through that process, it's then the file name is given a prefix that goes in the system, which allows us to understand, A, where it's come from. So it's really important to make sure you never lose your source name in your file naming, because you will never be able to find it again or match it up to your master material. And believe me, it happens, and it's a nightmare. But also we write things on the file name, which we then put on the actual screen, like burnt into the screen, which is temp must be replaced or not cleared, so that it's really clear to the director and the editor that this is something that they can't sort of fall in love with. But we also would not put that in the cut in the first place. So I guess not to go into too much detail, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about this later if they've got any questions about how to approach things, because this is, it's quite complicated. But I think it's really clear that you have to have a really clear system of methodology, and that system has to acknowledge where it comes from, who owns it, how much it's going to cost, what resolution it's at, and how you then get the high resolution, and whether it's in the cut or not. And they're the basics, I think.
Okay. What about, now this is something that I've used, how do you feel about saying, so I use the phrase best endeavours, when we've looked and looked and tried to find a copyright, you can't see this because I just saw Kate's face and it blanched. It was face of, oh, bloody hell, I hate it when people do that. Tell me about best endeavours.
I think best endeavours, fair use, written review, orphaned works, these are all terms that start to get bandied around when you can't find the copyright holder and the editor and director are determined to use this bit of footage that you have dropped in the cut that you just can't either afford or do whatever. So I guess it's really important to know that there are no fair use laws that apply to Australia. So if you are going to make any decisions about this, is actually a legal decision, and it's a decision that the production company or producer and their lawyer has to make about the risk the company is being exposed to. So I guess in that instance, I would say talk to your lawyer and make a decision about that. But the whole idea is to not get there in the first place. So if you do all the due diligence I sort of just mentioned in terms of workflow, you won't have to, or hopefully you won't have to start trying to clear things that, you can't clear in that way and use best endeavours. Sometimes there's a piece of footage that absolutely cannot be replaced with anything else that was provide so much to the story, and then you've tried your hardest to try and find it, and maybe that's when you use best endeavours, but really most of the time there will be something else. Yeah.
So what about, you mentioned very briefly crit and review or fair dealing. Just in that statement, are you happy to just give a quick overview of what people understand by that?
It's really complicated terminology because, as I mentioned, it's not something that is, I don't think it's legal as part of the Copyright Act in Australia. I think it is in the US, and the UK I'm not entirely sure about.
Yeah,
so
we totally let British people, oh yeah, we're all about crit and review. We're all about fair dealing.
So I think it's a case-by-case basis that is when you can use a work that's not yours, that you don't need to seek permission for, if the way that you're dealing with it is by discussing that work in a sort of critical way that relates to your overarching idea of that particular scene, which is an incredibly unclear way to say it. But I think it's about how that particular bit of work is used, what the narration around it is saying, and whether that'll pass, whether that would stand up in court, essentially. And the idea is that it probably won't stand up in court, but it's whether you as a production company and as an Australian production company and your lawyer are happy to take that risk. So I would just sum that up by saying that is a legal question, and I would definitely flick that to the lawyers before going down that path.
Okay, what about release forms for archive?
So when we talk about clearances, it's not just saying, is this cleared, and someone saying yes. It's actually a legally binding document, like a very short contract or pro forma, that is by the copyright owner, is signed by the copyright owner, and allows you as the producer to use that work within that particular film context and in whatever territory you choose or agree to exploit it in. There are templates for this on the Screen Australia website. I'm pretty sure the NFSA will have something similar as well if you really get stuck. But there is a clearance list, and there's also a materials clearance pro forma on the toolkit in Screen Australia. So that is, if you can't afford a lawyer because you're on a smaller production or you're just starting out, that's actually a really useful resource to make sure you've got your clearances in the first place for things like that. So, for example, if you're filming an interview with someone and there's an artwork in the background and it's that person's artwork, that's a great time to get them to sign that to say that you've got the clearance for that particular work. I would also say, just on that, but filming interviews with artwork in the background, just move the camera if you can, because you will have to film it. You will have to get everything cleared that's in the back of shot, unless it's obscured in some way. So anything that's sort of featured or full frame back of shot, like the work behind me there, would have to get cleared. That work has been cleared.
And it was one of the first things I asked you. Now, that brings us neatly onto cost. Archive and cost. Tell me, how big a line in my budget should it be?
That's a how long is a piece of string question. Archive costs is really hard to gauge at the start. The best way of sort of doing it is working out how much screen time you have allocated to archive. So if you've got a 15-minute film, perhaps a quarter of that film is going to be archived, so you work out what those minutes are, and then you work out the average amount per second is about 88, which is the ABC's flat rate cost, is $88 per second. Just use that as a ballpark. Unless you're using particularly expensive archive, like just say using more sports or more news, you might up that per second rate to 100. But I guess the thing really to keep in mind is that it changes there is no consistency across any licensing sources about how they do their costing. Some charge per clip, some charge per second, some charge per 30 seconds, some charge for one minute minimums. Often you can get better deals by bulk buying. So if you're going to, the idea is that if you're going to be selecting footage and you have a choice of between one and two sources, choose one source to get more of that footage from, because you're more likely to get a better deal in the long run. But it's also about relationships. So good archive producers and producers will have relationships with archive providers who are able to give them deals or help them do research and help them get the best that they can out of the licensing for particular projects. But it's really hard to guess. You have to guess until the end. So always add in more than you think it'll be.
Excellent. And you mentioned very briefly there an archive producer. How important is having an archive producer, and how much of a specialist role is that?
Okay, an archive producer is a very specialist role, and it's a role that involves someone who's got creative editorial skills, as well as incredibly methodical workflow sort of abilities, and also great negotiating skills. So they are incredibly useful on films or productions or series, especially when you have a lot of archive that's coming in. If you're on a smaller kind of project and you've only got one or two bits and pieces here, I'm sure you can work that out, yourself more or less. But if you're looking at large quantities of archive, getting an archive producer on board will save you a lot of hassle with licensing. And they'll be able to negotiate better deals for you. They'll know directly, like sometimes finding who owns the copyright for, say, a Warner Brothers title can take you weeks or months if you don't know the right person to go to. And then archive producers will shortcut all those ways for you, and they'll know how to speak the language of the person you're talking to get the best deal. They'll also be able to advise you when you're starting to get into complicated copyright areas where you might have to seek legal advice, or you might have to think creatively around that. And they will also know alternate sources of material, so they can help you think creatively about how you could replace that. If you can't find it, or you can't afford it, or you need something different, they can offer you other sources. So it's an integral role in archival filmmaking. Like I can't stress how important having someone whose sole job it is to look after that is, but only if the production that you've got has a significant amount of archive. You don't need an archive producer for 3 bits and pieces, I would say.
Is there a particular archive source or archive type that is a total nightmare?
Yes. When you're licensing any feature film, so if you're licensing feature films, particularly older ones, it can be really complicated working out who owns the rights, what the residuals are regarding the cast, and negotiating anything remotely reasonable in terms of price with, say, Warner Brothers or any of the big studios, because they don't make their money out of licensing their films. They don't care if you can't afford to pay $20,000 for 5 seconds of footage. They genuinely don't. In fact, it's more bothersome often than not to have to go through those sort of things. So think about using films really carefully. And also, I think I mentioned talk shows before, things or current affairs shows, or things that require their own kind of third-party releases within them, that's embedded within the footage that you're watching. So you might be able to watch Four Corners, and they might have some great footage that the Four Corners team have shot of Afghanistan, for example, but anyone that they interview as part of that might have a separate layer of clearances on top. And if it's some person in Afghanistan, you might never be able to find them to get the clearance to be able to use that particular thing. So think about what the material is made up of, and how that might be, like what other layers of clearances might be involved in it, before you, if that's the approach it in that way. Because if you start thinking about it slightly critically and differently, you might realise that it's actually made up of a whole bunch of different clearances. Also music, but we're not talking about too much about that. But anything that's got music on it, just make sure the music is included in the clearance, in the vision clearance.
Yeah, been there, made that mistake. Total nightmare. In fact, actually, you were the production manager of a show I worked. Yeah, you were nodding in a kind of like, oh, way. And we used loads of really great music, and you had to clear it all. And I appreciate that you did that. Thank you.
Yeah. They were very willing to share the music with you. Their publishing houses were not so keen. They hadn't struck the same deal.
It's totally true.
But we got there.
Of course. I never doubted for 1 second that you wouldn't get there. If I'm just starting out, if I'm just making, say, a short doco, and I'm thinking about archive, what are some of the sources that I might go to see what's out there? And is there any way of learning, if I'm a newbie to the world of archive, is there a way I can learn about archive?
I guess when you're looking for archive, it depends on what, it's incredibly broad. So I guess the first thing is, what is the topic? The more general archive sources are places like Shutterstock or Getty, who have incredibly broad, and Pond5 have incredibly broad content within their libraries. If you start to get more niche, you can start looking at places like Critical Past or Huntneys or these more historical places, for example. Most countries have the national records. So you have NARA in the States, which is the National American Record, I can't remember what it stands for, but NARA in the US. We have the NFSA here in Australia, the NAA and the NLA. Trove is a great place for historical Australian archival material. It kind of bundles all the libraries and all the national archive or the state archives together. But then start thinking a bit more laterally as well, and think about what's the topic. Are there enthusiast groups around there, people who might have had their own material or captured their own footage of it that you can reach out through social media or forums or different ways like that? Is there a historical society? Is there a skinheads of the 1970s fan club? All those kind of things, and you'll be surprised at the amount of material you can find by just looking slightly different, like coming at it from a different way. Searching on Google can be interesting because you can often find one image and then you can put it into the Google Images search and then find where it's been where it's appeared several different times, and then you can find the original copyright holder that way. That's one way of doing those kind of search. I think TinEye does a similar one. But yeah, I think it's just being lateral about who might have the kinds of images that you want, and how you might go about finding them. So yeah, I mean, there's so much material, so much content out there. You just got to work out. It's like detective mission on how to find it.
It's totally true. Google Image, we'll put a link to all of those places that Kate's just mentioned in the comments section, and definitely Google image search is amazing. I didn't learn about it till embarrassingly recently, and it is incredible. Now, Kate, if I want to watch a show that really shows off archive, what should I be watching?
There are so many incredible archive shows. I think recent Australian production, obviously, The Final Quarter, is told entirely through archive, and that's an incredibly well-crafted and skilled bit of storytelling using lots of news footage and other footage. I can't imagine the clearances on that. Maradona that I mentioned earlier, there's a great Julian Temple feature doc called London and Modern Babylon. That's one of my favourites. That's incredible. I Am Not Your Negro, which is another great feature documentary, Valerie, which I was talking about earlier when it's released. But also Australia in Colour, which is a series that's coming out, already come out here in Australia. So I think they're the ones to start with. There's Amy Senna, an incredible amount of well-told stories using archival material. Mystify. There's
now, is there anything else you want to tell us about archive, or any point that you want to really reiterate?
I guess just with all those films I've just listed, I guess if you're thinking about working with archival material and interested in learning about how you can tell a story in different ways, watch those films. Look at the material that's in there. Like the opening sequence to Maradona is incredible. It's all shot on, I don't know what it's shot on, but it's an incredible opening sequence, and it really sets the scene for that whole film. And it would have been, they wouldn't have had that to start with. They would have found that somewhere and sort of dug deep and gone around there. So I guess look at the films, look at how they've put their stories together using a variety of different archival sources, and sort of work backwards and just use that as inspiration for how you can tell your own stories.
Brilliant. Kate, thank you so much. I feel like I've learnt loads.
Oh, I've got one more thing to say.
Oh, yeah.
So one more thing. And also, if you're like, copyright is a legal thing. Like it's not something to just sort of ignore because it doesn't suit what you're trying to do at that point in time. If you have any questions about that, contact the NFSA or the Media Arts lawyers. They have a free service, or your own lawyer if you've got one, or even go to the Copyright Council, who have a bit of information on what's copyright, what's still in copyright, what's not, in what territories and whenever, or ask an archive producer. I'm sure will happily spare a couple of minutes just to help you out if you need. I think it's really important that if you don't understand it, try and get information elsewhere, and there's a lot of places you can do that.
Great. Thank you so much. That's it for Running Free Skills. You can join the conversation, #RunningFreeSkills. Thank you again to ACME, and see you, Kate.
Bye.